Okay, good evening. So I am Kim Matheson, and I have a joint position at the Royal and Carleton University as the Culture and Gender Mental Health Research Chair. I am a social psychologist, which means my approach to many of these issues has more to do with the social determinants of well-being as opposed to taking a clinical kind of approach. So this talk may be a little bit different for some of you. I've been working for about 20 years with my collaborator, Jaime Anisman, who is at Carleton University in the Department of Neuroscience. And his focus has always been on the sort of neurobiological determinants of stress-related pathologies like depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And we started working together because of my interest in marginalized populations and the implications for their well-being as a result of being exposed to many of the factors associated with systemic discrimination. Then about 13 years ago, we had a fabulous graduate student come to work with us, Amy Bombay, who's now at Dalhousie University, but came in to work with us from the University of Ottawa. She's from Rainy River First Nation. And with Amy, we started to do national surveys because of an interest that she had at the time on the intergenerational effects of the Indian residential schools. So we were looking at the offspring of the people who had survived their experience in Indian residential school to look at well-being, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. As a result of that work, we started to branch out to communicate and work with communities, and in particular communities in northwestern Ontario, where we were basically asked, okay, you guys have all this information and understanding now. We've been exposed, most of our people have been exposed to the Indian residential schools. What are you going to do for us? And so I started working up there. Amy went off to Dalhousie, so I'm the one who's doing the traveling now. And it's been a phenomenal experience that has given us many insights about working with Indigenous communities, and so I'll talk a little bit about that too. In all of this work, we have to understand that there's a context, that people don't have challenges or mental health challenges or illnesses out of context. There's a social and environmental factors that will contribute to those challenges. And that's not just the environment in which somebody lives in on a day-to-day basis, but it also involves relationships with other groups in society. And as Indigenous peoples today are advocating for their self-determination and equal treatment and reconciliation, they're doing that not by themselves, but in relationship to non-Indigenous Canadians. And so we've also done some research to try to understand how non-Indigenous Canadians are responding to these calls to action. And that's what feeds into how we can learn to better be allies to the Indigenous cause. So with that sort of background, I will talk a bit about that and then end with what I've learned from my perspective, but isn't going to be necessarily shared by everybody, what it means to be an ally. So put things in context. Indigenous peoples in Canada, we can start looking at the well-being. We can look at it in relation to individuals, but I think, again, contextualizing that well-being within the communities is important. We've looked at various kinds of data, including census data, and there is a measure called the Community Wellbeing Index. It's taken out of census data, and it's based on the levels of education, labor force participation, income, and housing within communities. And then communities get a score, and then they're ranked. In the 2010-2012 index, of the bottom 100 Canadian communities, all communities in Canada, 96 of them were First Nations, and of the top 100, only one was First Nations. This tells us two things. One, that there are some very much struggling First Nations communities in Canada, but it also tells us that there's a lot of diversity. There are clearly communities that are flourishing and that are doing well, and we always have to keep that diversity in mind. While many, like over 50% of Indigenous peoples actually live in urban contexts, there aren't as many health differences as we might expect. And all of the people who live in urban contexts, well, pretty much would have some roots to a community as well. So looking at the factors that communities are actually contending with across Canada, and again, there's going to be a lot of variability, we see that about a third of communities are dealing with on-reserve housing problems. The housing is either insufficient, meaning that there's crowding, there aren't enough houses to house everybody. So you'll see multiple generations of families living in a small house. I don't think there's an issue with the multiple generations, and many would choose that, but to live in the very closed, small spaces that they're living in is incredibly crowded and unhealthy. And housing is inadequate as well, which means it's in a need of repair. So about 50% of houses on First Nations communities actually have mold or mildew problems, but there are a host of other problems that require repair as well. So housing is a challenge. Over 2/3 of communities, First Nations communities, have been under a boil water advisory at least at some point in the past 10 years, and some communities have been on a steady state of boil water advisory for over 20 years, and some of those are in Ontario. Over half of on-reserve households experience food insecurity. This is particularly poignant in northern communities, northern remote communities where food has to be flown in or comes in on ice roads. And many communities have inadequate community infrastructure, including roads that may be gravel, creating a lot of dust problems, schools that are run down and not replaced, health resources, and community centers. So many communities won't even have a community center or a center for youth to hang out in. So this is going to have implications for health and well-being, of course. So if we look at the well-being of Indigenous adults, we see higher rates of mental health challenges, depression, trauma. We see higher rates of physical health challenges, diabetes, hepatitis, respiratory problems, HIV, AIDS, to name a few. When we look to urban Indigenous peoples, compared to the national average of 0.8% of the population being homeless, 7% of urban Indigenous peoples are homeless. They are far more likely to be exposed to victimization and to incarceration and exposure to the criminal justice system. When we look at mental health indicators, one of the ones that we've been looking at over a series of studies, some of which have been done in collaboration with Robin McQuaid, who's here today, we look at some of the national data, and this is the amalgamation of several studies or several surveys. So looking at this one, what you can see is that this is the percentage of people who report having suicidal thoughts over their lifetime. In the first column are non-Indigenous people taken from the Canadian Health Survey. Thank you, I knew community was the other word. And what we see there is about 9% of non-Indigenous Canadian adults report at some point in their lives that they have contemplated suicide. When we look at Indigenous peoples, the rates increases substantially. So when we look at First Nations on reserve, it jumps to 22%, which is an incredibly high number of people contemplating suicide. Off reserve, about 19%, and then among Métis and Inuit, around 15 or 18% as well. So all of the Indigenous populations that were assessed in these various surveys are reporting higher rates of suicidal ideation. This is going to have implications on the next generation, right, in terms of the children and youth. So what we see are children and youth coming to school and presenting with behavioral and learning problems. If you've been following the advocacy and work of Cindy Blackstock, then you know that nearly half of the children under 14 in foster care in Canada are Indigenous, despite the fact that Indigenous children make up only about 7% of the Canadian population. There are very high rates of youth substance use, in particular prescription drugs and opioids at this point in time. And suicide in some areas, I'd say, are almost epidemic, and particularly in northern communities, where suicide among youth 15 to 25 years are 5 to 7 times higher among First Nations youth and 11 times higher among Inuit. Again, a lot of variation across communities. So we present these statistics. Some communities haven't seen any suicide among their youth, whereas others, such as Bekanjikam in Northern Ontario, the rates are 50 times higher than the rest of the Canadian population. So huge variation. So where is all of this coming from? We do understand the notion of social determinants of health, that factors like poverty are going to contribute to physical and mental health. But then when we talk about Indigenous peoples, superimposed upon the social determinants is the issue of colonialism, which really makes the whole social determinants that much stronger in terms of their impacts, in part because colonialism has had huge effects on social structures, on identity, on access to the resources that would ordinarily serve as a coping resources for many of these communities. While most of the work that we've looked at has been in relation to the Indian residential schools, we can't look at that all by itself. That's part of an entire system in Canada where the goal was ultimately, in the words of the government of the days, an Indian problem that needed to be done away with. It started with treaties, it's involved in the Indian Act, and most recent that was of interest to us was the Indian residential schools. So treaties, first of all, again, we're looking here at the community well-being scores that are based on Canadian census data. The top line, the blue line, are non-Indigenous communities. Remember, these can be scored on a scale of about 0 to 100. And over time, we see that non-Indigenous communities, on average, are doing relatively well relative to the three types of Indigenous communities below. The lowest line, the yellow line, are the communities that are operating in relation to the Canadian government using historic treaties that were negotiated up until about 1923. The other two lines are either non-treaty First Nations or modern treaty First Nations. Modern treaties were usually negotiated in the context of comprehensive land claim settlements. And so they are much more likely to meet the needs of the communities, and the communities were far more engaged in the process to ensure that their priorities were met. And we see that those communities, and in particular the modern communities, fare much better than those who are operating under historic treaties. The historic treaties were often negotiated with First Nations peoples. There wasn't always a clear understanding of what had been negotiated or even the meaning of the terms. So when the federal government was negotiating for access to the land, that meant something very different to First Nations who were promised, yes, you can still use the land for hunting, fishing, and so on, but if they've just had all the trees clear cut, it's really hard to still be fishing and hunting and so on. So there was not the same understanding of what was meant, and of course many of these treaties were not honored by the federal government. So those communities tend to be struggling more. The Indian Act was not a negotiated piece of legislation. It was unilaterally imposed by Canada on, in the day, Indian peoples. Compliance was dictated by federally appointed Indian agents who oversaw the implementation of the Indian Act on reserves. Indigenous peoples were in effect made wards of the state. They were viewed as not being capable of taking care of themselves, and so the federal government would have to take care of them. They were pretty much dispossessed of their traditional lands, moved on to very small reserves in the middle of their land. So even if they were nomadic, they were forced to stay on the reserves. And that picture up in the corner is actually a permission slip that a person had to get from the Indian agent to be able to leave the reserve. It changed the traditional forms of governance into the band and councils that we see today, but it also altered all sorts of leadership and kinship lines in communities. Criminalized spiritual practices, cultural activities and ceremonies. Voting rights weren't given until 1960. Forced enfranchisement, which meant that people would be forced out of Indian status, and a whole host of other laws. The forced out of Indian status was particularly, again, problematic for women. Indigenous women or First Nations women who married somebody who was not First Nations lost status. And that wasn't changed until about 1985, and there are still problems in terms of the offspring and their status as Indian. So the Canadian government decided who was or wasn't Indian. These have implications for their rights. So if you lose status, you no longer have the right to live on reserve. And so if you've grown up on a reserve and that's where your community is and you marry out, you no longer have the right to stay. So it has very negative implications to lose that status. It also oversaw the enforcement of the Indian residential schools and why so many parents had to send their children to school, to the Indian residential schools, because they would be penalized criminally if they did not, if they hid their children. We know that the Indian residential schools were a way of basically killing the Indian and the child, removing children from their family and their communities where they would be socialized into Indigenous culture and taking them out to be socialized into Euro-Christian cultures. So 130 schools operated throughout Canada. They were run in partnership between the churches and the federal government. I'm not going to go into the details of it. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission did do a national sort of events in order to hear the testimonies of people who had experienced Indian residential schools. And if you haven't had the opportunity to read at least a summary report, it is actually something that I think every Canadian should try to read. And it's very well written in terms of understanding the implications of Indian residential schools for Indigenous peoples today. However, we do have some data here that looked at the proportion of First Nations adults who attended Indian residential school and then reported the negative impacts of various adversities encountered at the Indian residential schools. And these are national data, the Regional Health Survey. What you can see is that they divided it out into those kids who had been at the schools for more than 3 years. Some kids, they got taken away and put into the school, and they never came home again until they graduated. So for some, that could have been 10, 12 years where they never saw their community again. Others were able to go home during summers, and others were only in the schools for a shorter period of time. Whether they were there for a long or short period of time, the rates of the sort of loss of their own Indigenous culture, their language, their spirituality, their identity was very high, particularly among those who had been there longer, though. Abuse was rampant. I don't think any of us could even imagine a school where through the lifetime of being at a school, 40% or over 40% were sexually assaulted. And then at the bottom are the basic life needs. Were those met in these schools? And where you can see again is very high rates of children not having the proper clothing, food, living in harsh conditions, and in the end, not being able to come away with saying that they had a good education. So when we look at the state of Indigenous communities and peoples today, you can see how many present that we're seeing high rates of youth suicide, self-harm, alcohol use, poverty, trauma, abuse, children in the child welfare agencies. But underlying all of these outcomes, these are really symptoms of what is underneath. The root causes are not that we're talking about weak or bad people. We're talking about people who have been exposed to basically colonization, and both historically and currently. The kids in foster care is today. Even those who have been exposed to the Indian residential schools, closed in 1996, many people that you'll encounter today have been to the Indian residential schools. This is not the past. This is a present that still continues to pervade the lives of Indigenous peoples. So our work has looked at how these intergenerational effects actually come about. So we have done a number of studies. We did a number of national surveys, and 3 waves of them that were online surveys, or people could do them paper and pencil. That was in a different day. This was all prior to the release of the TRC report, looking at the experiences of the offspring of people who had been to an Indian residential school. We've conducted interviews with survivors and service providers, and again, in some of the most recent work with Robin, we've been looking at data that is held by the First Nations Information Governance Center. Our analyses in these data has been almost entirely on First Nations peoples and participants, as opposed to Inuit or Métis. So right from the early start of looking at these data, we started to look at the implications of parental or grandparents going to Indian residential school in relation to psychological distress of now adults of those offspring. Psychological distress in this case were scores on the Beck Depression Inventory. And what you can see is that the adults whose parents or grandparents had never gone to an Indian residential school were at the low end of reporting symptoms. If even one parent or a grandparent had gone to Indian residential school, we saw an increase in the levels of distress. And if both went, then the rates were even higher, suggesting that there is a cumulative effect in terms of the parents and the implications for the subsequent generations. We also see this in the regional health survey data, looking at in this case, adults living on reserve who report a suicide attempt. The pattern is very similar to the last slide I just showed you. So when neither the parent or grandparent had been to Indian residential schools, 8% indicated a suicide attempt at some point in their lives. This went up to about 13% if a grandparent or parent attended, and up to 17% if a parent and grandparent had attended. Again, suggesting the cumulative effect of parental attendance at the Indian residential schools. So what's happening here? What's causing these intergenerational impacts? And we don't have the answers, in part because some of these studies aren't easy to collect and to identify actual causes of what could be contributing to intergenerational effects. And in particular, but we can look to other literatures. And so when we look at how trauma can be transmitted across generations, one of the more recent areas of research has looked at the issue of epigenetics. And basically what that means is that the parents who experience trauma prior to the birth of a child or prenatally, it changes the expression of particular genes that may render the child more sensitive to stressors when they're either early in childhood or growing up, so that they're going to and then end up demonstrating higher rates of, for example, depression or other stress-related disorders. Those are changeable. If there's a very positive early life experience, then you don't see those potential epigenetic changes or alterations expressing themselves. Likewise, a very poor childhood environment could compound the likelihood of them being expressed. But biological isn't the only way, and in fact, we know very little on humans about those biological changes, and it's an area I know that Robin and Amy Bombay are trying to establish an opportunity to work with Indigenous peoples across Canada to start looking at these issues. But there's many others that are going to change, right? So the parenting practices, if you've grown up in an environment in an Indian residential school that is sort of cold and non-loving, that is abusive, that makes you ashamed of who you are, how do you learn to be a parent to your own child? If you're suffering from other mental health disorders, how can you be a really good parent to your own child? Social relationships changed. One of the things that was on that previous figure is that there was a lot of bullying in the schools, and a lot of bullying was actually encouraged by the staff because it kept kids watching kids. It kept kids in check and afraid of each other and broke down social bonds. So when people go back to their communities and they've been the victim or the bullies, and those social bonds are no longer there, there's going to be a lot of mistrust across the community, a mistrust of one another, and that's going to show itself in terms of the raising of children as well. And community traditions are gone. Again, if you've been away at an Indian residential school, you can be sure that they're not teaching. In fact, they explicitly would not teach the community practices that would ordinarily bring people together in terms of communal child raising, in terms of training children to be able to work on the land and to access the resources that would normally help them to cope with the adversities that they encounter. The Indian residential schools really did a number on Indigenous peoples in Canada. But, we talk a lot about the trauma and the victimization and the oppression and colonization of Indigenous peoples, but the story has to have some balance. There is a lot of evidence of resilience, of strength, of perseverance, of a real leadership in terms of bringing about changes in communities and for communities and Indigenous peoples in Canada. And so we need to understand that as well if we're going to be good allies with Indigenous peoples. Very speculative. In fact, I'm not sure I've seen much in the way of research yet, but there is some evident research with humans yet, definitely not with Indigenous peoples, that epigenetics can also build resilience, or it can turn on or off genes that might result in resilience that may not look like resilience under normal circumstances. So I'm just thinking of even the oxytocin and how some of Robin's data primarily has shown that some of the polymorphisms of people who do not show the normal sort of attachment behaviors are actually in some ways protected against early life trauma because you're less sensitive to what's going on around you in your environment, and it may allow you to be more resilient over time when you're still in, poor living conditions. So there may be an epigenetic role that contributes to the perseverance of Indigenous peoples. We've done some research asking offspring about their parents' communication to them about the residential schools. Sometimes that communication has been very difficult for offspring to hear, particularly when parents talk about the abusive experiences that they encountered and their own trauma gets shared with the child. But we also saw lots of stories of parents talking about some of what they learned and the positive experiences that they had in Indian residential schools. And when they were able to talk about those more positive experiences, it diminished the tendency for offspring to show things like depressive symptoms. So they ended up faring actually much better when parents talked about, for example, their ways of coping within the Indian residential schools. Hockey is a big thing. Sports were a big thing in many of these schools, and for many, especially boys, it was a way of coping with everything that was going on around them, and it transcended their time in the residential schools. Hockey's still big in Northern Ontario, that's for sure. They talked about the use of humor and practical jokes that they would play on each other and the staff, and they would be able to laugh about these situations. They talked about the friendships that developed when they were in the Indian residential schools. All of these showing pathways to coping with adversities. Elders in particular, these at this point in time are turned to in several research studies to talk to youth not about just the bad things that had happened to them in the past, but again, how they have persevered and demonstrated strength and gone on and moved on from their residential experience, even if they had bad times, how they would overcome them. And so those kinds of communications, again, are associated with better well-being among the listening offspring. Many of the offspring didn't even know their parents had been through Indian residential school until the TRC events, and then they heard that their mother or father had been to Indian residential school, and for them it put things into perspective. And for some, that allowed them to forgive a parent. Not all, many did not, but some did, and it allowed them to sort of take the situation and move forward. I put in here one of the quotes from one of the participants who said, "There was no hugging or kissing or saying, 'I love you' while I was growing up. I'm taking the first step now and always greeting my mother with a kiss and a hug and an 'I love you.'" And again, overcoming that past of what the parent had gone through and demonstrating to her own offspring how to be a good parent and child. And finally, many of the communities are reclaiming stories. They're starting to tell their stories, their own legends, their own myths again. And these stories are incredibly important because many are an oral society or culture, and the stories conveyed messages of learning, of wisdom, of values, of social norms. And so by people starting to tell those stories again, then the subsequent generations are starting to, again, be able to understand where they come from and how to cope with the adversities around them. Communities are building strengths. So what I'm seeing a lot of in Northern Ontario is that communities are actively trying to bring back land-based activities. There is a common ground across communities that being on the land is healthy, and so they're getting out and they're trying to teach the kids, fishing, they're teaching them camping, they're getting them out there. They're teaching them how to, well, they might not, as kids, be hunting the moose or the caribou, because that's pretty hard work, but they're snaring, they're having to work with the older people in terms of skinning the animals or even defeathering the Canada geese, which I got to watch last week, something I don't see down here. There is the older people, the elders often speak their own language. The subsequent generations that went to Indian residential school may understand it, very few speak it, and very few of the children speak it. Many communities are trying to revive that and bring it back. They're starting to do the cultural practices that have been part of their own history, building again a positive community identity through community feasts and just being together. And they're trying to again rebuild the family values that were basically destroyed through the Indian residential schools. So we're seeing communities and individuals showing a great deal of resilience. Times are changing, and the last time I gave this talk, I did it with my collaborator from the Sioux Lookout region, who's First Nations, and we talked a lot about the changing times and how many communities, through the Truth and Reconciliation report and calls to action, really were validated to start talking about their experiences and to begin healing and understanding who they were and how to move forward. They're also looking for opportunities to find common ground and cause with non-Indigenous Canadians, which is what reconciliation is about on their part, but we also have to do our part. And so when they're seeking alliances that are respectful, non-judgmental, and equal. So what has been the response of Canada, and some of its government's response, and some of it is the response of non-Indigenous Canadians? So Canada, we've been hearing about the Indian residential school experience, Basically, it was Phil Fontaine in 1990 who was the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who very publicly came out about the abuses that he had experienced in Indian residential schools. And that sort of was a watershed moment for many people who had been to the schools to begin talking about their experience and getting validation. Coming out of that, there was a whole set of processes and legal actions, but for the purposes of today, we saw the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, which was a very large research project looking at the status of Indigenous peoples in Canada, with a report and a set of recommendations in 1996, many of which got ignored. In 2008, the federal government issued an apology for the treatment of those who went to the Indian residential schools, and I'll talk a bit more about it in a moment. And most recently, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in 2015 with its calls to action. So, how do Canadians react to these? So when Prime Minister Harper gave an apology on behalf of Canada to the former students for what they had experienced in Indian residential schools, he talked about forging a new relationship between Aboriginal peoples and other Canadians and moving towards healing, reconciliation, and resolution. This was 11 years ago. And so already we're starting to see the language of wanting to make that relationship better and to be able for Indigenous peoples to be finally treated with respect and equality. We did a survey of Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians following the apology, and then we looked at the responses or reactions a year later among the same people. Among Indigenous peoples, the apology was the beginning. They saw this as opening the doors to a dialogue and a discussion that would hopefully bring about change. For non-Indigenous Canadians, for many of them, the apology, they've got their apology, let's move on, right? So although there was an awareness immediately following the apology, 1 year later, we see a decrease in perceptions that Indigenous peoples are still affected by the Indian residential schools. And we also saw a decrease in the need for any further government action. They now had their apology. And there wasn't a greater sensitivity to the continued discrimination against Indigenous peoples over that period of time, which we might have thought would have happened as that people became more aware of what had been going on historically. We've also done a different kind of study, but looked at the views of non-Indigenous Canadians following the release of the Truth and Reconciliation report. And again, there's a lot of variability. I think the media this time round has been incredibly good in terms of getting out the stories of what has been happening in the Indian residential schools and covering the strengths of Indigenous peoples and the need for healing and reconciliation. It's one of the few times we can't blame the media for Canadians' responses. But what we do see starting to emerge is something that we call system justification. Many Canadians kind of feel guilty about what happened collectively. They don't say, oh, I did this, but this is what happened because of non-Indigenous settlers in Canada. And so what that starts to do is trigger a whole set of justifications to justify why things are the way they are and justify the need to move on. So you'll see this these are qualitative data that we had analyzed for the themes of how people were expressing their reactions to the TRC and the Indian residential schools. So people will distance it. It was in the past. This is not today, so let's get over it. And progress can't be made until Indigenous peoples just forget about it and move on. They have to forgive Canadians and move on. At the same time, what we also see is that there's a continued perception that because communities are so troubled, that the Canadian government still needs stewardship over Indigenous peoples. We have to keep them accountable and responsible because they can't take care of themselves, very reminiscent of the Indian Act mentality. But people don't mean it badly. They just think that they're doing the right thing. That's the sad thing about system justifications, is that people think this is just the way things are and this is what we have to live with. And they don't think that they're being racist. Many people believe that Indigenous peoples benefit from social programs that members of the majority do not. They don't understand the context of what Indigenous peoples receive in relation to treaties, nor do they understand what they don't receive as a result of treaty agreements and them being overseen by the federal as opposed to provincial and municipal governments. There are strong assimilationist attitudes that people should just move out of those communities that are too poor and too small to really resource into the cities where things are scalable. So why are they still on the land? Just move out. And where you might not think they should move out, well, things are so bad, there's just nothing we can do. Where do you start? This is a lost cause. I have a friend who's down in the States whose sister is Canadian who came down to visit her, and this friend in the States has been doing a lot of this research with me. In fact, she's been doing research on system justification for many years, and she said, I do this research, but I've never ever heard somebody that I know say these things. And her sister came to visit, and she text messaged me that night, and she said, I just heard every single justification when the conversation turned to Indigenous peoples in Canada. Every single one of them was expressed. These are the norms in terms of Canadian views. And in fact, if you do surveys of Canadians' views towards Indigenous peoples, even people who we think should know better, university students are educated, they're exposed to these things, should know better. Over 50% of them are still endorsing the very negative stereotypes of Indigenous peoples and expressing more racist attitudes. That's recent research. So there's a challenge here if we're going to change the views of non-Indigenous Canadians. On the one hand, we really want to make salient to non-Indigenous Canadians the experience that Indigenous peoples have had of being victimized by the sort of Euro-Christian Canadian society over time. And when we hear these stories, many of us do feel sympathy. We do feel sad. I mean, there's a human propensity to feel sorry for the underdog. And so when we hear about these poor kids and the torture some of them encountered in the Indian residential schools, it can't help but pull your heartstrings. We want to see social justice. It's just not right. And we know that fundamentally. But when we start talking about social justice, we also start talking or triggering another fundamental motivation that underlies much of our behavior, and that's the need to believe in a just world. And many of us, that sort of drives our everyday behavior. If you study for an exam, you're going to do well. If I work hard, then I'm going to get a good job. If I do a good interview, I'm going to get the job. If I really go beyond myself, I'm going to get promoted. We have to believe that our world is predictable and that if we do all the right things, that we're going to get what we deserve. And if we do the wrong things, we're not going to get it. And so if something bad has happened, then maybe that person deserved it, either because of their behavior or whatever reason. So then we start looking at reactions and the sort of insidious implications of this for how we respond to what people who have been through a trauma like the Indian residential schools must the point they must come to. And this has been found not just with Indian residential schools, but trauma more generally. When justice motives are made salient, then we look for how people who have experienced trauma must have benefited. They must have got something good out of it. And we hear the phrases, it builds character. If it doesn't kill you, it'll make you stronger. And so it strengthens, the trauma should strengthen our appreciation for what we have and what's around us. And so we start moving into a different kind of psychology then when we think about the victimization of Indigenous peoples in the Indian residential schools. Sure, we feel sympathy, but they'll be stronger for it. And our data are showing that that there is strong, we are seeing a lot of reporting of that sense that it has strengthened Indigenous peoples, and we particularly see it among participants who have also endorsed some of those system justifying attitudes. So there is a positive correlation with those tendencies. So if highlighting victimization doesn't work, or it just makes you feel sympathetic, then what about highlighting the strengths of Indigenous peoples, how they have persevered despite their past? And again, there is evidence to suggest that when we highlight strengths, this is more likely to have us respect people and to see them as equals. Wow, what they've been through and came out of it, still standing. I could never have done that. And so it does elicit a sense of respect. But with that respect also comes a sense of greater obligation or expectations. The past is the past. You've grown from it now. And so there is an expectation that you're now going to take responsibility for yourself, that you're going to feel a sense of responsibility for the well-being of the people around you, and that you are obligated now to act like a better person. Something that we actually tend not to apply necessarily to the perpetrators of the harm. So again, what our data are showing is that there is, when we highlight the strengths of Indigenous peoples, there is a greater sense that they are now obligated to be better people. This is associated with them seeing, okay, you've grown from the experience, you've derived some psychological benefit, and now you should demonstrate that through action. And again, if we work back, that this is more likely to be expressed by people who are justifying the system as it stands. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So basically then we have a hard context to work with that psychologically for us as allies to try and resolve. On the one hand, we're very aware of the victimization of Indigenous peoples. I think many of us are today. Others aren't, but that's a different issue altogether. We're aware of the Indian residential schools. We're aware of the continued victimization of Indigenous children, either through the incredible advocacy of Cindy Blackstock. There's increasing awareness of the 60s scoop and what that has done to Indigenous peoples, and that will probably we're becoming much more aware of that through the legal challenges that are taking place now. And of course, most recently, we've seen the report in the last couple of weeks of the victimization of Indigenous women and girls through the inquiry of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. On the other hand, we do hear very strong Indigenous leaders advocating for self-determination and the ability to negotiate with Canada on a nation-to-nation basis, that there is equality. We're hearing about the entitlement to cultural rights and to treaty rights and the expectation that Canada lives up to its treaty rights, and a very strong advocacy for recognition of equality. So we also have the strength. This sets up psychological tensions. I talked about system justification, the psychological benefit leading to perceptions of greater obligation to be responsible and accountable. But inside of it also creates tensions. We have this feeling of sympathy, and we want to help, and too many go a little bit too far, and we're going to save you. We're going to go into your communities and save you from all of the bad things happening. To the other side, that can be the extreme, the laissez-faire. Okay, they can do all these things, we just leave them alone to do it. And you have people saying, okay, just abolish the Indian Act and just leave them to do their own thing. Well, we've already got centuries of putting Indigenous communities in a particular place. That needs to be worked through. This is a relationship. You don't just take away the whole of the house and say you're on your own. We have tensions that we talk about around advocacy, so the need to advocate, especially to one another on behalf of Indigenous peoples, to do that education. And in fact, we are often asked to advocate on behalf of Indigenous peoples to use our privilege and our status within non-Indigenous Canada to advocate. At the same time as not wanting to be appropriating voice. So Indigenous peoples can speak for themselves. We don't have to do it for them, but we do have to understand what our role is in advocacy, especially with one another, versus appropriating voice. And then there's the other tension that I would call patronizing or paternalistic, of wanting to help out because we know that there are so many things going on by providing and developing solutions. And we see the Canadian government do this a little too often still, coming up with the legislation, coming up with the frameworks, and then presenting it to Indigenous. Here you have it. We've got the solution for you. Which is very different from trying to move the agenda forward, which typically isn't about coming up with a solution, but working with Indigenous communities to try to sometimes build capacity and to facilitate their ability to identify the appropriate solutions. But these are not easy. I mean, there isn't a line that tells you this is what you're doing, and we make mistakes. Becoming an ally is a process, and it's a mistake-making process. We don't, I mean, again, I've been working, I guess, starting with Amy for almost 15 years and working in this area, and I make lots of mistakes. Some of them will be forgiven, and some of them won't. Some people are more sensitive, and they see you as just another reminder of every other non-Indigenous Canadian in their minds and what they think. And some of them will understand that what you're trying to do is change the relationship. And you have to live with that. This is a history. It isn't just about you. And then we take responsibility to learn from it by trying to do things better. So we've been working with Indigenous communities, I said, for about 5 years now. This is the Indigenous Youth Futures Partnership, which is a program of research that's funded actually by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, that brings together academic researchers with community-based organizations and communities in northwestern Ontario, to try to work with the communities to create the conditions for youth to flourish within their own community. It is research, but it's research through action. So we don't go in and say, okay, we're going to do a survey and then we're going to go away with our graduate students and analyze it and we'll publish it and it'll be all accessible here as the journals, which has been the history for many of these communities. It's about action. It's going in and working with them to say, okay, where do you want to be? What do you want to be able to do? Do we have the tools that can support you, or can we support you to find the people who may have the tools to be able to help you get to where you want? This is just an idea of where we're working. So this is you see the full map of Ontario at the top. This is the northern part of it. Thunder Bay is at the very bottom. I was in the airport a few weeks ago listening to someone on the phone to somebody down in Toronto saying, I'm way up here in this remote region of Thunder Bay. And I'm thinking, yeah, right. I was actually on my way to Fort Severn, which is the community at the very top, and Sioux Lookout is the one in red. So there are 49 communities in what is the Nishnawbe Aski Nation region. We work with communities in the Sioux Lookout First Nations Health Authority, and there are 33 communities there. They vary in size from under 100 to 3,000. Language, they're Cree, Ojibwe, Ojibwe. Spirituality, some of them are heavily Christianized, and you don't see any of the traditional spirituality, whereas others are well on their way to reclaiming that sense of traditional spirituality. Different tribal councils, different levels of socioeconomic status. So Fort Severn, we have 95% employment. In other communities, it's the reverse. all of their, and then their geographical, you can see the range of where they are from north to south, east to west. Some of them do have road access. The majority of them are remote communities in the sense that you can only get in by those little airplanes or winter ice roads, which is how they get most of their supplies. So a huge variability across the region in terms of the nature of the communities that are there. They get most of their service in terms of health and education. So they all have primary schools, but only a few have high school education. Some of it's all internet. And then they have to go to Sioux-Lookout or Thunder Bay, reminiscent of the residential school of experience. And in fact, one of them is a residential school, and the other would probably be safer if it was in Thunder Bay. So what have we learned by working with communities? So as a non-Indigenous academic, well, first and foremost is that diversity, both between communities and within communities. And within communities, there can sometimes be lots of division. Some of that's just healthy differences in a community. Sometimes it's leading to serious conflicts. As a researcher, I'm used to, sort of developing my research question, my hypothesis. I go out and collect my data, and then I analyze my data and then make recommendations. And I can do that pretty quickly. This research has been a complete eye-opener. And some of these communities, we've been there and working on a relationship for 3 years and still not have any data. It's all about relationships. There's so much mistrust and so much misunderstanding that a lot of time is spent just building that trust in who we are, trying to convey that we respect where the community's coming from and trying to understand it and to be judgmental. And it's especially hard when they can be so judgmental on themselves as well. And so trying to sort of move around that. We've discovered a real need to be flexibility, and it's, part of it's weather, trying to fly up to these communities, but part of it is that most are at a point of crisis at some point in any given year. We've had one community right now where we're just re-engaging because a few months ago a little girl who was 7 years old was murdered by a family member. They had had a suicide in the fall, and in the late summer they had to have a whole new election because they threw out their entire chief and council that had just been voted in a few months earlier. And you can't go in and say, okay, guys, let's start talking about the future, because they're in crisis mode. And so we have to learn to adapt to that. And finally is understanding capacity. So communities do want to turn things around, but you're in crisis mode too often. And so the people are in crisis mode trying to deal with what's happening. And it's very hard to plan out to where do we want to be in 5 years, and let's put together a theory of change and implementation framework for getting there. So they do need support. That's something that we can enable. We just have to be able to do it on their time, in their time. Even the local regional partners, the health authority, the schools, they're also very pressed. To get people into regions like this who are dedicated, there's a lot of burnout. And so there's a constant turnover, especially in the schools. Teachers come and go. Kids get used to teachers coming in for a year, if they last a year, and going, and new teachers coming in all the time. So we can't rely on the organizations. And the academics are also sometimes a challenge. So because of the way academia works, your careers are built on research and publications. And so to put young people, young academics into these communities where it takes several years to even start talking about how you're going to collect data is just not, it can't work. And so you have senior people like me who are going in and building up these relationships and trying to have that longer term continuity as to where they want to go. But, I'm going to retire one of these days. And so there needs to be that system building in terms of capacity. So here's now I'm on my podium of how to be an ally. These are my views. They're, and it's through the experiences and trying to understand how to position myself, because I would like to be a good ally. So if I were to say to people, what does that mean to me? What are the actions of an ally? It starts with understanding those roots to the challenges that Indigenous communities experience, Indigenous peoples experience, even urban Indigenous. There is a long history here, and we have to understand that and not just look at the state of Indigenous peoples today and not recognize where this is all coming from. There's lots out there to read, and starting with, as I said, the Truth and Reconciliation report, in particular the legacy, is incredibly informative. While we recognize that, yes, we do have to understand that there's huge strengths there. These aren't people who need us to come save them. There are huge strengths that need to be built on, and our job is to help create the conditions for them to build on those strengths and to flourish. I've already pointed out there's a huge diversity across individuals, communities, cultures, all across this country. I see a lot of the diversity in Northwestern Ontario. The cultural background of the community, the nations in Southern Ontario is very different from Northern Ontario, very different from the West Coast, East Coast, Inuit, and so on. So there isn't an Indigenous people, there are very many peoples and cultures. Learning to listen, this is at the IMHR, I assume everybody understands listening is central to the kinds of work that people would do here. And knowing when you make mistakes and how people react to you doesn't mean the conversation should become about you and feeling sorry for you because you meant so well. It does mean listening and hearing when you've made mistakes and trying to move on from that. And finally, taking responsibility. We do have value to add. We can't just walk away. This is a relationship. And so without sort of, in your own relationships with your partners, you don't sort of take over the solution and tell your partner what to do. You work things out. You try to negotiate what's going to work for both of you so that you're both equally happy. That's our responsibility to do in relation to Indigenous peoples. And that is it. Thank you.